Hi everyone, welcome. What you see here is a big bowl of radish leaves, and that's pretty much all I've got for them. But as you can see, this bowl is not only melted and broken and taped together, but it's full. It's pretty much full of radish leaves, and even though I generally consider radish leaves to be a fairly lightweight feeding, there's so much of it there that does actually seem like a fairly substantial feeding. And the lucky worms that are going to be receiving those radish leaves are the mixed red worms. And following tradition, at least for this system, I've already captured feeding number 18 of radish leaves on our tracking sheet. We've been doing this ping pong feeding in this bin, going from one end of the bin to the other, back and forth, alternating the side of the bin on which we feed. And as you can see, the first two feedings were not done that way, but the last 16 were. Well, the last 15. Today's feeding will be the 16th ping pong feeding. So we're going to get this bin up on the bench, and we're going to proceed with giving them their radish leaves on the right side of the bin, or at least the right side of the bin from the perspective of where I sit. I think it's upside down from my point of view. I don't know. We'll sort that out on the bench. So let's get to work. So here on the diagram, I show where this label is attached, and it also depicts where the label is affixed to the side of the bin. So the alignment of the bin relative to where you're looking at it is set properly now. So yeah, we are going to be feeding on the side of the bin, which from your point of view is the right side of the bin, meaning the last time we fed would have been over on this side, and that's the reason we've got that coffee filter over there serving the function of feeding zone indicator. It looks like a few worms have actually come up to hang out on this plastic. You can see them in between the bubbles, coming up to bask in the lovely condensation that collects on the plastic. And let's see how this piece of top covering newspaper is holding up. It does seem like they've done quite a job on it. Kind of makes me question whether or not we can get one more use out of it, or is it best just to include it as bedding down in the feeding zone, you know? In most cases, when one of our top coverings has gotten pretty worn down like this, we do upgrade its purpose to not just be a top covering, but to serve the purpose of supplemental bedding. And traditionally, we always take the old diagram from last time, use that as supplemental bedding as well. So even though I've got my my prepared bedding here, I'm starting to wonder if we even need it, because we do have that pretty large piece of newspaper as well as the old diagram, which might be plenty as far as as far as bedding goes down in the feeding zone. I mean, we do have a fairly significant amount of food to squeeze into the feeding zone as well. So I think we're going to have to open a pretty good size hole. But before we excavate the side of the bin where we're going to be feeding, we're going to follow suit with checking out how the last feeding goes, or has gone. And it consisted of cantaloupe melon, fed to them 12 days ago. We also threw a few crackers in there. And then there's other things that we might bump into. And the nice thing about this diagram is it's constantly calculating the age of everything that was placed into the system. So the only thing we're doing over on this side is checking in, but then we'll just return everything back down there after we've caught a glimpse of what they're working on down here and how they're doing. And then we'll proceed to opening up the opposite side of the bin to provide them with that lovely pile of radish leaves. So this feeding zone is definitely well populated. It does feel to me like every time I scoop down in there, I can feel a lot of moisture. I've got some bins where I've already started transitioning away from plastic coverings because I started sensing that the moisture levels might be starting to get a bit much. And a lot of times it's just the stickiness of the material and its tendency to just stick to my glove that serves as an indicator to me that perhaps it's time to begin letting system air out. But as we reconstruct, we can examine some of the things that we fed recently, such as pumpkin stem, up on the top of the list, 152 days old, but there's 2 down, 105-day-old pumpkin stem, so I don't know if the other one is nearby. Should be easy enough to locate, or maybe not. So as we bump into pumpkin stems, we'll know how old they are. This thing over here is the stem of a Brussels sprout, which is now 82 days of age. Feeding number 11. Coming along quite nicely. And, oh, here's that other pumpkin stem. I would almost have to say that this is the younger one, because I still think I see a hint of green on it. This might be the older one. And I think those were the objects that are expected to take quite a long time before we see no sign of them. I would imagine that these are leftovers of the last feeding, and probably the only leftovers we'll see of the last feeding, because I doubt that those crackers we gave them are going to still remain as leftovers. Unless, of course, that's what we're seeing here, maybe? No, that looks more like paper to me. So, a couple more pieces of cantaloupe rind. Let's just plow through this pile a little bit better so we can return all the food scraps down before we backfill. Yeah, maybe we'll even bump into, yep. There's a pretty good example of leftovers. A piece of cantaloupe rind, which actually has a pretty good sized chunk of the cantaloupe melon still attached to it that they're still working down. And I imagine that this white stuff is some of those crackers that we included with the last feeding as well. So let's give these little guys a break. In a way, I am tempted to add bedding, but I wish I had dry bedding. My prepared bedding is moistened, and it does feel to me almost like it would be nice to throw some dry stuff into these feeding zones to suck up some of what appears to me like perhaps a little bit excess moisture. So, I don't know, here's another piece of cantaloupe rind with a good bit of melon still on it. Interesting. Let's just get it submerged under the surface. That's the way I like to have my foods, usually out of reach of any sort of curious insects or anything else that might be wandering around my worm bins trying to scavenge some food. But now I think we're prepared to begin excavating the side of the bin that we will be feeding today, where I doubt we'll see as an interesting worm turnout as the spot where we last fed, but we do have some interesting food items in here. That's a pretty good sized food item, right? But it's totally hollow. It's a gourd, which was fed 72 days ago over there on feeding number 12. And that's the stem of a banana. I mean, we don't need to look up the age of every object we locate, but sometimes it is interesting on some of these slower moving objects to see just how long it's been in there now. This is the seed of an avocado, and I did notice another one earlier, or at least that's what I thought this was. It's so strange how some of them appear to be so dark in color, and then other ones are just really light in color. I wonder why that is. Unless, again, maybe there's always that possibility that I'm getting things mixed up. One of the things that was, I believe, on this side of the system entered into the bin or placed into the bin 139 days ago are these little corn cob spheres. And we usually do manage to bump into at least a couple of them. And it is pretty amazing how long corn cob lasts in a worm bin. Up until the last check-in, we were still encountering a couple of them holding together. But I think one of them might have already shattered in my hand when we encountered it. But I do kind of want to, here's some avocado shell, and even more of it. I don't want to get in the habit of like trying to hunt down things that we know are in here but might not be revealing their presence. So we'll just continue opening up a nice size hole here. If we bump into a a little chunk of corn cob sphere, then we'll get to check it out. But I think they've been gradually breaking over time and vanishing out of view as a result of breaking. Even though I think we did have perhaps one or two remaining that were still more or less intact. But I think we've created a hole big enough here into which we can drop today's food. So we'll bring back the old diagram and the old top covering to become the foundational bedding for today's feeding. And before we throw in the old stuff, perhaps we can drop in this massive pile of radish leaves. It is a lot. And how did this radish sneak into here? Oops. Oh well. Seems like a shame. I'm not sure if you can even eat a radish after it's been frozen, but I guess that was just a really quick and dirty attempt at separating the radishes from the leaves. And looks like the worms are going to benefit from that oversight by actually receiving a radish to nibble on too, in addition to the leaves. So let's get the avocado pits, the avocado shells back in. The gourd has already been put back in, and still haven't encountered any of the corn cob spheres, but I think that's just part of the game sometimes. You don't always run into stuff when you're checking in on your worm bins. So I think we're more or less done here. Oh, guess what? I spoke too soon. This is one of the corn cob spheres, and it's almost guaranteed that when we find one of these, there's going to be at least a worm or two huddled down inside the little hole of the thing. So, I mean, I do have a bunch of these things still laying around that I have not put to use yet. And at the rate at which they get consumed by the worms, it does seem like one of these days I should get around to feeding those as well. But for whatever reason, I just sort of get a kick out of having these weird novelty type foods laying around sometimes, thinking that it would be interesting to come up with some sort of an interesting way to feed it to the worms. And you know, I'm going to put the feeding zone back on, feeding zone indicator back on. The old one appears to be in good enough shape to be reused, so we'll put that right there to show where we last fed. But before we put the plastic back on, we're going to need to put some sort of a top covering paper on here. And I'm actually going to give this a little bit more thought before we put on the plastic again. If we put the plastic back on again, I think because of the high level of moisture in here, it might just be enough to put a newspaper covering on here. And then I'll just make sure that the plastic has no worms left on it. I'll make sure that I've returned them to the bin, and then maybe going forward we'll just go ahead with paper coverings. I think that's going to be the way to go. So why don't we leave it at that? I'll take care of those extra things as homework. But before I go really quick, let me just say thank you. Thank you so much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. That's very much appreciated as well. All right, everyone, thanks so much for watching. Have a great day. Bye now.